It was supposed to be a funeral, a solemn day in Nairobi. The stage was quiet, the crowd respectful. Then Kenya's Prime Cabinet Secretary Musalia Mudavadi stepped to the microphone and fired a shot across the continent. He didn't aim it at the mourners. He didn't speak of the dead. Instead, he turned to a man not even in the room. A man who never ran for office, who doesn't wear a tie, who doesn't speak in polished English, who doesn't even speak. Ibrahim Traoré, he said, though not by name. Those masked men, that's not leadership. That's theater. That's fear. It wasn't just a political jab, it was a warning. Kenya, a democracy by title, had just launched a rhetorical missile at a captain from Burkina Faso. Why he holds no seat at the African Union. He hasn't funded any rebellion. He hasn't insulted anyone. He simply grows cassava in silence and lets his work speak. So ask yourself, if he's just a mirage, why are they so afraid? If he's a ghost, why do presidents and prime ministers tremble when his name is whispered on the streets of Dakar, Nairobi, and Johannesburg? This isn't a story about one soldier. It's about a system cracking. Because when a government begins to fear a farmer more than a foreign army, something has changed. This time, the silence is not weakness. It is power. And it is spreading. Subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than official speeches. Comment below. What kind of leadership does Africa deserve? Share this if you believe the time of waiting is over and the time of building has begun. It wasn't just the grief that stunned the crowd, it was what was said and who it was said about. The funeral had drawn national attention in Kenya. Public figures arrived in polished suits, motorcades lined the street, and cameras rolled across the lawn. But no one expected the turning point to come not from a eulogy, but from a declaration of fear. Musalia Mudavadi, Kenya's Prime Cabinet Secretary, took the stage with all the decorum of a seasoned statesman. But instead of words of comfort, he launched into a speech that would reverberate far beyond the cemetery gates. What you see online? Those masked faces, those uniforms, that is not leadership, he said sharply. That is theater. That is fear. A civilian government, even when flawed, is better than a military regime. He didn't mention Ibrahim Traoré by name, but he didn't have to. The message was clear. This wasn't about mourning the dead. This was about warning the living. And the target wasn't in Nairobi. He was 3,000 miles away in Burkina Faso. A 36-year-old captain with no formal election behind him, no seat at the African Union table, and no expensive PR team pushing glossy headlines. Just a rifle on his back, mud on his boots, and silence in his strategy. And yet somehow, he had become the most talked-about man in Africa. Traoré hadn't given a speech, he hadn't made threats, he hadn't commented on Kenya at all, but here stood one of Kenya's most powerful officials using a funeral to denounce a leader halfway across the continent. Why? Because a whisper from Ouagadougou had grown louder than a speech in Nairobi. Because a young soldier who walked the farms of Bobo Dioulasso had become more relevant to Kenya's youth than their own elected officials. Because in the streets, on matatus, in sermons and social media, his image, his name was rising. They didn't call him president. They called him captain. And that terrified them. In politics, you expect leaders to fear rebellion, coups, or economic collapse. But this was different. Kenya, a nation that calls itself the beacon of East African democracy, had decided its greatest threat wasn't a hostile neighbor or an armed militia. It was a man who grows cassava and redistributes land. It wasn't what Traoré said, it was what he represents. A different model. A model that rejects optics and embraces outcomes. That trades press conferences for plows. That doesn't negotiate with foreign donors, but digs with local hands. And it was catching on. In Kenya, youth began quoting him not for what he promised, but for what he had done. While President Ruto flew to IMF meetings, Traoré walked through sorghum fields. While Kenya debated taxes, Burkina Faso planted. While Nairobi spoke of GDP, Ouagadougou distributed cassava. No slogans, no sound bites, just results. Kenya's Gen Z wasn't looking for a savior. They were looking for proof that something different was possible, and they found it in the soil of Burkina Faso. What began as viral TikToks and protest graffiti soon turned into something deeper. Traoré wasn't just trending, he was resonating. In a country where the cost of living exploded, where jobs vanished and voices were criminalized, young Kenyans started to ask the unthinkable. If they can build sovereignty under sanctions, why can't we build stability with billion-dollar budgets? If he can do more with less, why do we keep getting less from those with more? The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A Kenyan administration still wiping blood from its streets was now posturing about the dangers of military regimes. An administration under fire for police brutality, corruption, and economic sabotage had found its scapegoat, a soldier with a shovel in another country. But why now? Because the center was cracking. By the time Mudavadi's words hit the airwaves, the streets of Nairobi had already been soaked in tear gas and filled with youth demanding justice, jobs, and bread. Kenya's leadership didn't need another enemy, but it desperately needed a distraction. So they turned to Traoré and accused him, without saying his name, of being the embodiment of what Kenya must never become. But if that's true, why do the youth chant his name? Why do his slogans show up on protest signs, matados, and murals? Why does his silence feel more honest than Ruto's speeches? Because what's happening isn't political, it's moral. The real question isn't about Traoré, it's about Kenya. Let's set aside Burkina Faso for a moment. Let's just ask this: what kind of democracy arrests students for holding signs that read, "We are hungry"? What kind of democracy raises taxes on sanitary pads but protects ministers accused of embezzlement? What kind of democracy silences journalists, intimidates artists, and brutalizes protesters? A democracy in name only. And that's the point. Traoré isn't threatening Kenya with tanks or propaganda. He's threatening them with an example of how things could be done differently. And when an example becomes more powerful than a constitution, governments panic. They rush to label, to smear, to distract, to warn. But deep down they know this isn't about one man. It's about what he exposes, that Africa is no longer inspired by big words. It's moved by small deeds. It's no longer convinced by suits and conferences. It's watching those with mud on their boots and grain in their hands. And that truth, that awakening, began at a funeral, where one government tried to bury its fear with words, and instead unearthed a revolution. Subscribe if you believe silent actions speak louder than political speeches. Comment below. Should we judge leaders by what they wear or by what they grow? June 25, 2025. Nairobi. It began like many protests before it: handmade signs, whistle students in worn-out school shoes, posters with the words, "We are hungry, not violent." But that afternoon would not end like the others. That afternoon would become a breaking point. As crowds of mostly teenagers gathered in downtown Nairobi, police deployed in full riot gear. Within minutes, the chants were drowned out by sirens. Then came the tear gas. Then the bullets. Witnesses say the police opened fire without warning. Bystanders ran for cover. Some tried to shield the younger ones. Some fell and never rose again. One boy, just 19, was shot in the chest outside a supermarket. His cardboard sign, now soaked in blood, read, "I want food, not fear." He carried no weapon, only a phone in his left hand. Another 21 had disappeared 3 days earlier after tweeting criticism of the finance bill. His body was found outside Kisumu, beaten, burned, and dumped like trash. Official numbers said 115 had died since the protests began. But the truth, as always, lies buried deeper. The rivers told their own stories. So did the whispers in the night. Parents who waited for children who never came home. Friends who carried grief in silence. Names that trended for one day before being replaced by silence. And through all of this, the president said little. He called for order. He warned against chaos. He said democracy must not be sabotaged. But what kind of democracy beats poets and buries teenagers? As bodies fell, so did microphones. Journalists who covered the protests were fired. Radio shows that aired dissenting voices were suspended. Bloggers were arrested under vague cybercrime laws. One even disappeared after publishing drone footage of police brutality. Across Nairobi, a chilling phrase began circulating: "Don't mention the president. They'll come for you." The system wasn't just cracking, it was hardening fast. Even former Chief Justice David Maraga, once seen as a pillar of Kenya's constitutional integrity, broke his silence. He called for Ruto's impeachment, citing gross violations of public trust. But even that didn't move the needle. Because how do you impeach an entire mindset, a system where ballots are sacred but bodies are disposable? While Kenya bled, Traoré said nothing. No tweets, no condemnation, no interviews. But his silence echoed like thunder. Because on the same day Nairobi mourned, its young images surfaced of Traoré in Bobo Dioulasso distributing land deeds to women, inaugurating a new rural clinic, visiting cassava farms. No podiums, no cameras, just work. The contrast couldn't be more glaring. In Kenya, youth begging for jobs. In Burkina Faso, youth being handed land. In Kenya, slogans on placards. In Burkina Faso, seeds in soil. In Kenya, fear for speaking out. In Burkina Faso, pride in digging in. The continent was watching. And for many, it wasn't Traoré's silence that was alarming. It was how deeply it exposed the failure of leaders who never stop talking but never start building. By July 2025, graffiti of Traoré's face began appearing on walls in Nairobi. He doesn't speak. He grows, one slogan read. In church sermons, preachers began referencing him not as a messiah, but as a metaphor. As Captain Traoré says, we must till the land before it tilts us toward death. On TikTok, youth made montage videos, footage of tear-gassed students juxtaposed with clips of Traoré opening schools or walking barefoot through village roads. It wasn't hero worship. It was a question. Why not us? If Burkina Faso, sanctioned, landlocked, war-torn, could find a way to feed its people, why was Kenya, with its highways and embassies, so busy feeding excuses? If a soldier without a blue checkmark could triple state revenue by nationalizing gold, why was a Western-backed government still borrowing to buy sugar? The answers didn't matter anymore. The doubt had already taken root. Desperate to regain control of the narrative, government officials tried a different strategy. They laughed. He's not real, one advisor said. It's AI-generated propaganda, fantasy for frustrated youth. The mainstream media joined in. Beware of mirages, one headline read. A military regime in sheep's clothing warned another. But by then, it was too late. Because you can mock a man, but you can't mock momentum. You can dismiss a symbol, but you cannot dismiss what it symbolizes. Traoré had become a mirror, not perfect, not saintly, but powerful enough to make millions ask if he can, why can't they? And that's what terrified them, not the man, not the uniform, but the idea. That hope could grow in a cassava field, that sovereignty could bloom without IMF loans, that dignity could rise from silence. Subscribe if you believe leadership should be seen in action, not just heard in speeches. Comment below. When was the last time your government made you feel seen, not just governed? What happens when the final thread between a government and its people snaps? Not the law, not the military, not even the economy, but trust. That's what Kenya is now facing, not just protests, not just bad headlines, but a collapse in the social contract. A moment where faith in the system itself has been shattered. For many Kenyans, especially the young, that trust was once fragile. Now it is ash. President William Ruto came to power in 2022 riding the promise of change. His campaign spoke to the poor, the hustlers, the forgotten. He wasn't just a politician, he was their rebellion against the elite. But just 2 years later, the hustler had become the hammer. Instead of fighting corruption, he raised taxes on diapers and internet. Instead of lifting youth, he buried them. Instead of transparency, he cloaked his decisions in impunity. The finance bill was the final straw. It didn't just hurt, it humiliated. You cannot ask a starving mother to pay more for cooking oil while ministers ride in armored convoys. You cannot tax students' Wi-Fi while lawmakers steal billions from healthcare budgets. The message was clear. The system doesn't just ignore the poor, it punishes them for being poor. Across Kenya, the youth are no longer asking, how can we fix this? They are asking, what are we even fixing? Unemployment among those under 35 has climbed past 35%. University graduates carry degrees and debt, but no opportunities. Mental health services are underfunded, underprioritized, and overwhelmed. Young men are increasingly turning to despair. Suicide rates have quietly surged. In rural towns, they disappear to the cities in search of work that doesn't exist. In urban slums, they wake up to police sirens instead of job offers. And into that void walks a shadow not of a savior, but of an alternative. Traoré. He doesn't promise jobs, he gives land. He doesn't campaign, he cultivates. And for a generation that has only known broken systems, that feels like revolution. The Kenyan government continues to insist, we are a democracy. We have courts, we have elections, we have a free press. But the people are no longer convinced by labels. They want lived experience. not lip service. What good is a vote if your voice gets you jailed? What good is a parliament if it votes against your survival? What good is freedom if it requires permission to protest? As one protest sign read, "We voted, we waited, we are still hungry." And this is where the damage turns permanent, because governments can suppress protests, but they cannot suppress comparisons. And everywhere comparisons are being made, Kenya builds highways to private estates. Burkina Faso builds rural hospitals. Kenya holds economic forums with IMF executives. Burkina Faso holds village town halls with sorghum farmers. Kenya silences the hungry. Burkina Faso feeds them. Even in the slums of Nairobi, youth whisper a truth few politicians dare say aloud. Maybe we don't need democracy. Maybe we just need dignity. That's a dangerous thought, not because it's wrong, but because it's real. And once people taste that thought, they cannot unthink it. Institutions are fraying. The judiciary is under pressure. The media is shrinking. Civil society is exhausted. The police are weaponized. Parliament is seen not as a place of debate, but as a marketplace for self-interest. And the leadership's response: blame foreign influences, accuse youth of extremism, mock those who offer alternatives. But every insult aimed at Traoré only amplifies him. Every denial of truth only deepens the hunger for it. And that's the real cost, not the fallen buildings, but the fallen belief. It's no longer who's in charge, it's what are they building. And if the answer is fear, surveillance, and slogans, then the people will look elsewhere. And many already are. They're looking at farmers in Burkina Faso, at tractors instead of tanks, at grain instead of GDP. They're looking at results, not rhetoric. And when that shift happens, it doesn't just change elections, it changes everything. Subscribe if you believe dignity should come before democracy on paper. Comment below. What is your government actually building for you? The United States has not officially condemned Ibrahim Traoré, but it hasn't endorsed him either. Instead, it watches, from embassy balconies in Nairobi, from State Department cables marked sensitive, from think tank panels discussing instability in the Sahel. And what they see isn't just a military man, they see a disruption. Because Traoré is rewriting the rules without asking permission. He rejects IMF loans, refuses foreign troops, expels private contractors, and calls out colonial economic models. And yet, he's not imploding, he's building. For Washington, this is a problem not because Traoré threatens U.S. interests directly, but because he defies the narrative that says African sovereignty must be managed, that success must be supervised, that reform must come through elections approved by observers and backed by donors. But what happens when a nation under sanctions with no Western funding thrives? When it builds clinics with gold money that used to flow to French companies? When it feeds its people without World Bank food subsidies? That's not instability, that's a precedent. And precedents are dangerous for systems built on control, so the U.S. doesn't condemn. But it doesn't support either. It waits, hoping perhaps that Traoré fails on his own. Meanwhile, Kenya, the so-called pillar of democracy, receives aid, military training, and diplomatic cover, even as it shoots teenagers and jails bloggers. Because in geopolitics, predictability matters more than principle. Traoré, he's not predictable. He doesn't hire PR firms. He doesn't attend summits in Davos. He doesn't fit. And yet his image is showing up on American college campuses, on activist forums, even in black churches in Atlanta and Detroit, where pastors quote him as a man who tills instead of tweets. Traoré is no longer just a West African figure. He is becoming a symbol in the global South, not because he claims moral high ground, but because he planted it. In the end, this was never about Traoré. It was never about uniforms or speeches or AU summits. It was about something far more threatening to the status quo, a quiet alternative. A farmer in fatigues, not funded by Washington, not invited to Davos, not propped up by PR firms, but followed, revered, whispered about across markets, across classrooms, across continents. He never asked to lead anyone beyond Burkina Faso. And yet his shadow stretches across Nairobi, because what he plants is not just cassava. It is doubt. Doubt in systems that preach freedom but fear food sovereignty. Doubt in democracies that offer ballots but bury bodies. Doubt in leaders who raise taxes on flour but not on failure. And now that doubt is growing. In Kenya, the youth are no longer just marching, they're remembering. Remembering that leadership isn't about microphones. It's about mouths fed. It's about fields restored. It's about dignity, not decorum. They ask if he can do that under sanctions. Why can't ours with billions? They ask if sovereignty is possible there. Why is silence mandatory here? They ask if he walks with farmers. Why do ours fly to fundraisers? These questions are not treason. They are the beginning of awakening, and it terrifies those who still rule by optics instead of outcomes. Because this moment right now is not about left or right, not about military or civilian, not even about Kenya or Burkina Faso. It's about a new African vocabulary. One that speaks with deeds, not slogans. One that feeds before it campaigns. One that refuses to beg for dignity, it grows it. So now we ask you, the viewer, what kind of leadership does Africa truly deserve? Is it the one that rules with borrowed language and borrowed budgets? Or the one that builds barefoot and bold from the soil up? Subscribe if you believe Africa must stop apologizing for wanting food, land justice, and peace at the same time. Share this if you feel the world must listen not to who speaks loudest, but to who acts deepest. Comment below. Do you still believe democracy is enough, or should we now ask for more?